All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. If you are here for program evaluation for mentoring programs, working with youth impacted by substance misuse, you are in the right place. We're super excited to be here with you all today. My name is Jake Sullivan. I work with Mentor National as the training delivery manager. We'll give folks another minute or two just to keep joining in. Again, if you're just joining now, we're here to talk about program evaluation for mentoring programs working with youth impacted by substance misuse. It's a really exciting conversation that we're going to have today, and I'm really excited later to introduce the amazing panel of guests that we have to talk about this on the more on the research side and also on the ground application side. While we're waiting, feel free to drop your name and where you're located in the chat. We definitely want to get to know all of you a little bit more and tailor this conversation to the folks who are joining with us today in the room. So again, if you're just joining now, feel free to drop in your name and location. Seeing we got some Virginia, Vermont, more Virginia. Great. I'm located in Baltimore, Maryland, if anybody's in this area. Texas. Amazing. Awesome. So for folks who are just joining in, today we'll be talking about program evaluation for mentoring programs working with youth impacted by substance misuse. And I'll actually get us started. First, we do have some housekeeping things to go over. Again, thanks all for joining us today. Just for your awareness, all attendees have been muted for best sound, but again, we do still want to hear from you all and hear your voices and your ideas and experiences. So feel free to type questions in the Q&A panel, but also type comments in the chat box. So again, throughout the webinar, if you have questions or thoughts, throw those in the chat or the Q&A box. By clicking on the CC at the bottom of the screen, you can enable live captions. And then we'll have a couple polls for you all to respond to in just a minute. Again, so that we get to know a little bit more about your experience with this specific topic and the type of mentoring program that you might work with. Just as a reminder, all attendees will receive an email with instructions on how to access a PDF of presentation slides and the webinar recording. There will be a quick, about 3 to 4 minute anonymous survey at the end of the webinar. So please help us by filling that out and providing any sort of feedback that you have. We're constantly improving these webinars. And again, we want to know what works, what doesn't, and what you would like to see in the future. As a brief note, these webinars and generally speaking, the National Mentoring Resource Center is a project that's funded through a cooperative agreement from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, otherwise known as OJJDP, Office of Justice Programs, and the U.S. Department of Justice. The National Mentoring Resource Center, again, otherwise known as NMRC, builds on OJDDP's history, leadership, and investments in quality youth mentoring. For a little bit of an overview on what the National Mentoring Resource Center offers, of course, we do have the website, which is our main resource, and on there you'll find practitioner-focused blogs, a specific kind of dedicated part of the site for grantees, all sorts of numerous research-vetted resources along with evidence reviews on programs, models, and populations. We have a really, really amazing research board, actually, who we have one of our members of that research board who will be the moderator for today's panel, who I'll introduce in just a second, who's always working on a variety of different research projects alongside the NMRC and Mentor. And finally, you can apply for no-cost assistance. So that includes training and technical assistance for your youth mentoring program through the website on NMRC. All right, now we'll get into the polls for today's webinar. Let me launch those. The first one will be asking you, what is your role in the mentoring field? And I know a lot of us all wear multiple hats in the mentoring field, so feel free to pick which one you're wearing today or which one you like the most. And we'll give you all a couple seconds before we end that poll to answer that. And the poll now. Thanks all for participating in that. If I click share results, you should all be able to see that. It looks like most of us are either mentoring program staff practitioners, and then we also have a few other groups represented, researchers, TA providers. Again, we're excited for everybody to be here. And of course, all of your perspectives are valid and welcomed. And so please share your experiences in the chat with us. I believe I have one or two more polls. Let's see, back. And yes, so you should see another poll launching on your screen now. And this one is to get to know a little bit more about the type of mentoring program that you work with. So the first question will be, what type of mentoring program are you involved with? Again, sometimes there's some overlap or there's multiple options that would apply, but just pick which one you would want to focus on today. And then the next question is, what is your mentoring program's focus? Again, sometimes mentoring programs have multiple focuses. Pick whatever one you'd like. So I will share the results. It looks like we have actually a cool split between community-based mentoring, in-school mentoring programs, and site-based mentoring programs, as far as what type of mentoring programs our audience is involved in today. And then what is the focus of the mentoring programs that are represented here? Again, a pretty even split amongst a bunch of them, academic success being one of them, substance misuse prevention and intervention, career development, skill development, community engagement, and mental health. Again, today's webinar will focus specifically on substance misuse programs working with youth impacted by substance misuse, but a lot of this information is applicable to all types of program evaluation and mentoring programs. So again, feel free to drop in the chat how this applies to what the work you're doing. All right, and I'll close those out. Thank you all for answering those. Very quickly, for an overview of today's agenda, first we'll be getting into some statistics and kind of focusing on why do we focus on programs for youth impacted by substance misuse specifically in today's webinar? What are the unique challenges and opportunities there? And then why is it important to do a program evaluation in general? We'll move into a case study example to kind of walk through some of these theoretical topics and provide practical applications, moving into some evaluation standards. The bulk of today's webinar will be focused on a discussion amongst our panelists on the feasibility of conducting program evaluation. So how does all of this that we're talking about actually play out in real life, and kind of the challenges and benefits of doing a program evaluation? We'll have some time at the end for an audience Q&A, but of course, feel free to drop those questions in as they come before sharing a couple resources and closing out. Now I'm very excited to introduce our panelists today, and I'll stop talking and I'll let them introduce ourselves. But first I'll introduce Dr. Gizem Erdem, our moderator for today, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. Welcome everyone. I'm Gizem Erdem. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Koç University in Istanbul. And before that, I was a postdoctoral researcher at UIC, University of Illinois Chicago. And I was working with David Dubois on youth mentoring program evaluation, especially to promote positive youth development and also prevent criminal behavior. And I'm trained as a couple and family therapist. So my prior work has been focusing on more the substance misusing populations and their family members. So that included at-risk youth, different groups of at-risk youth, actually runaway and homeless youth, and also some treatment-seeking mothers, substance misusing mothers with adolescent children in their care, and also homeless families who were also substance misusing. And in those projects, I had a variety of different roles. I was a researcher, but also a family therapist. And also in some projects, I was an outreach worker. So I worked at a drop-in center for homeless youth to connect them to services. So that was pretty much similar to kind of like mentoring when you think about it, because we were matched with those youth and we were trying to get them into services, and they really didn't trust the system at all. As I was working as a family therapist in those programs, it was focusing on understanding some evidence-based practices that would be helpful to reduce substance use through implementing some strategies to build family resilience, cohesion in those, and also building relationships with those families. And so I'm also a research board member as Jake mentioned, at NMRC. And I'm also working with the board to evaluate those programs. And we actually wrote a research evidence review with Michelle Kaufman on substance use. And that will be also another resource that we're going to talk about today. So that's all from me. Thank you so much. Maybe we move on to Nikki.
Hi guys, my name is Nikki Evans. I'm a Director of Specialized Programming with Boys and Girls Club of the Suncoast in Pinellas County, Florida. We are launching an opioid prevention program in all of our 21 local middle schools. We're actually taking over their opioid prevention and their health components. So we're hoping to visit over 9,000 students in the year. And what we're doing is just working to introduce trauma-informed care on top of opioid prevention. We've discovered with our youth that we interact with that trauma-informed care goes hand in hand with opioid prevention, and that's kind of what we're focusing on. My introduction is very short and sweet, but I'll pass it on to Brooke.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Brooke Allen Mixon, and I am here representing Knoxville Leadership Foundation, but specifically that Amachi Knoxville mentoring program. And I'm sure you can hear the Tennessee in my voice, and if not, I'm absolutely shocked, but I was born and raised here in Knoxville, and actually I'm a first-generation college student here at the University of Tennessee, and obtained my psychology degree and then kind of realized very quickly I had a lot more learning to do. And so went back to obtain a master's in social work. And I always make this kind of joke that mentoring really found me in my life. I didn't really seek it out. And I'm blessed for that because I just am so passionate about the world of mentoring and love the work I've done here at Amachi, and started here as an intern originally and have really moved into almost every role, match support, group coordination, recruitment, and I actually now serve as the director of the program and have been for the past year and a half. So I've had a lot of learning that's come at me very quickly, but I'm so blessed for that, and a lot of mentors in my adulthood that have poured into my life to lead me where I'm at today. If you all aren't familiar with Amachi, we are a national model, but local here to Knoxville for our specific program that serves 4 to 17-year-olds. And that focus really being youth that have been impacted by incarceration. So a lot of our youth have a parent or guardian currently in prison or jail. And so we just aim to provide another adult to walk alongside that single caregiver, to be a support system for that family unit. And so a lot of our program is community-based. We do have some site-based matches as well in some local elementary schools, but I'll be spending a lot of time focusing on those community-based matches and how we can, evaluate that program model. So excited to be here today and look forward to share any insights I have with you guys.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Brooke. Yeah, so in this case, maybe we get started with the substance misuse and why it is important for us to think about that. And it looks like a couple of people are also here who are coming from programs that are focusing on that issue. So we decided that it's important to, at first, to see how that looks like in the US at that moment. And these are some statistics from our recent review on substance use prevention and intervention programs that are using mentoring. And we see that the prevalence rates for alcohol is especially high for adolescents up to the 12th grade. So that's up to 70%. For any type of illegal drug, we see that it's up to 50% of those youth have ever tasted or have ever tried any type of illegal drug. And we also see that those prevalence estimates are showing the prescription drug use and opioids are relatively lower. They are up to 20% to 3.6% respectively. But that being said, that doesn't deny the fact that we still have an ongoing opioid crisis, and it's quite important that we focus on the prevention efforts in that sense. But when we think about the programs that are targeting that issue among adolescents, the adolescent substance use, to our surprise, there were fewer programs than we anticipated. And when we saw those programs, there were fewer program evaluation outcome evaluation studies. And that's especially the case for the mentoring fields. Most of the time, the prevention science is focusing on family-focused interventions or some life skills interventions. But in mentoring field, we still see that it is relatively lower. So usually most of the programs are focusing on academic achievement, social emotional skills, more like promotion of the youth development itself, which is of course important, but the prevention aspect that is specifically focusing on substance use is relatively less when we think about it. And we saw that there were some promising findings, of course. We saw out of 10 studies that we identified, there were 4 that showed reductions in substance use in terms of number of days that the adolescents were using, and also some protective factors in terms of their general use. So that included alcohol and drugs, of course. We didn't include tobacco, so that those statistics are not including that. And we see that in terms of the scarcity of, and also the need for mentoring programs to focus on that, we see the mentor study has shown that only 3% of the mentoring programs nationwide are listing substance misuse as one of their top priority areas. So I think that's quite important, and maybe that requires, I think, a whole different webinar on its own, why this is the case, how this is the case, and can we really move forward with the field to focus on that topic more. But that's part aside. Today we're going to talk about the evaluation part. But before we do that, I want to ask Brooke and Nikki about their regions and how that's going for them in terms of the prevalence, mentoring programs available out there in their regions that they are working, and also any program evaluation programs that are going on that they would, projects, especially research studies that they would want to share.
I can start, Nikki, if you're okay.
Yeah,
with that.
perfect. I'll let you go first and I'll hop in after.
Perfect. So I think when I was, reading some of these stats, I wasn't shocked by them by any means. I think it's something that we see boots on the ground mimic here in our local area as well. I think when I look at this big picture, what was always hard for me when I started in the world of mentoring is how can I connect the ongoing crisis of the opioid epidemic to our littles, and what does that look like? And so when I started to realize how that worked in tandem with one another, it started to become clear to me of what are those focus steps and what is the data we need to be looking at to know that we're really doing the work that we want to do. For me, when I started here in Amachi, I was always like, we have to train mentors on the opioid epidemic and they're going to be working with a 4-year-old. Like, that just was so crazy for me to try to wrap my mind around. And then I will say, when I actually became a mentor myself and I was working with a younger child, when that topic got addressed with me, I was like, this is why. This is the moment, and this is what we have to prepare mentors for. And so just some data, I think here we see in Knoxville, we looked at the overdose deaths, the estimated overdose deaths. And what we realized is that number was going down pre-COVID. And then we started to see that number tailor back up again. And so in 2020, we had 383 in Knox County alone that were suspected overdose deaths. And then that number skyrocketed in 2021 to be 498. And so what I usually, when we're doing any type of training to our mentors, I will actually share with them in the room 498 people in 2021 alone. And those family members had cousins, nieces, nephews, brothers, sisters, parents, uncles, and these people had lives and loved ones that were left behind. And that is why it's so important for us to talk about this, because we're going to be working with those young people that have seen and dealt with things that maybe ourselves we don't even understand fully how large this issue is. And so I think when I brought myself down to that level, it was a lot easier for me to understand why we need to share this information with our volunteers. And so then I use that, community data, and then I look at the data of our program specifically. And so if you heard me earlier, we talk a lot about, youth impacted by incarceration, and that's our focal area. We started to take that data and then look, okay, well, what if we started asking families if it was a substance abuse charge? That way we can still take the data that we wanted to take and then add to it to understand kind of the effects of this larger issue. And so we have 75% of our kids impacted by incarceration. And what we found after just a few years of collecting data is that 30% of those youth have a parent incarcerated due to a substance-related charge. And so then we can start to see how these things are working and molding together. And so recently we started polling our mentors on, are they having discussions with their young people about, drugs and alcohol? And what we found is that 80% of our mentors in our most recent study actually were confident that their mentee would say no to drug use. And that to me was like, wow, we are preparing and equipping our volunteers to have these conversations, because it may be the only space that our young people are going to discuss this. Because when I was young, I'm not going to my mom or dad or grandparents and saying, this is the topic I want to talk about. But when I have a trusted adult that's kind of outside of my family unit, I may be more likely to talk about what's going on, in my classroom. I think that's all I have to add.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that also shows us that when we think about the prevalence rates, it's not only limited to substance use by adolescents, but it's also about the substance use that they are exposed to, right? So the environment that they are in, the parental use, or whether or not it's available in their community, and any type of loss they may have experienced, material or emotional, relational, that is related to substance use. So thank you for bringing that up. Nikki, you have anything to add to that?
So for our region in Pinellas County, we saw a similar, where we saw a decrease before COVID, and then once COVID happened, we saw an increase. We're sitting at a plateau right now. So we have seen a 5% steady increase from year to year, and we've kind of plateaued in our region, in our area, which is hopeful. But we're sitting at about over 600 deaths a year in overdose, or we like to call them accidental poisonings. So for us, when we're looking at our community and our youth, and we speak to our youth, about 95% of our youth are impacted. They either know somebody who's overdosed, they've lost a family member, a close friend, who has been battling with addiction, those kind of things. So it is affecting our kids. And for us, we kind of focus at Boys and Girls Club, we focus on a group mentoring base. So we're not able to see our kids one-on-one, but we're able to see our kids in a classroom setting and in a group setting. And what we like to focus on for our sake is ensuring that our kids have the proper problem-solving skills and identifying those adults that they can go to. So when we're looking at our mentor programs, that's kind of what we're focusing on, is how can we help them identify the adults that they can go to in their immediate family and their school, or how are they able to get resources that they need. So that's kind of what we focus on, and that's kind of where we're at right now. We're really focusing on our middle school youth. Not that it's not reaching our younger ones, but if we can get our middle school youth to identify the proper people to speak to, and identify resources, it'll trickle into the family. So that's our goal right now.
So it looks like you are, so that also explains why you are focusing on trauma-informed care in addition to mentoring, because you emphasize that those adolescents have experienced a family member or a friend, having an overdose, and that loss also has some consequences for them. And I also hear from you that you are focusing a lot on the resilience, right? So how youth can identify those role models in their communities and reach out to them. Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, that's fine. And, in our area, we don't have a lot of prevention programs right now. We're currently one of the only ones in our area that is providing a service even remotely close to anything in prevention. We have a lot of organizations that are in recovery, which is really helpful. But really looking at our youth, there's not a lot of organizations, and especially in our area, we're starting to also see a trend in our youth using, and we have several programs that have high school. It's called Victory High, and it is a high school that is catered to youth battling addiction themselves. And right now we have 2 in our immediate area, and if I'm not mistaken, I think there's less than 30 in the entire nation. just to offer some other resources. And that's it.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that. Maybe we continue with the program evolution. So that looks like we have taken a snapshot of what's available in your communities, and also what are some of the programs that are also being delivered in that sense. But here we see that obviously we know that this is an ongoing issue across the board, and we have also webinar participants from different regions of the United States. And but the question becomes, well, we know this is important, but why do we need program evaluation? So we could simply go with understanding the issue and how prevalent that is, and implement our program. Because the program evaluation itself is very costly, it is very time consuming, you need a lot of resources for it, and sometimes you need to work with some experts, and you may not necessarily have those resources in your organization to do that. And you may be also in need of working with the issue immediately, and you may not necessarily have that time to plan ahead. But still, in this webinar, I think it's important to emphasize the utility of program evaluation in the long term, because it helps us in many ways to build more effective and also more efficient programs for our youth. And I'm just going to give you some examples related to that. For instance, let's say you have a program that is working with a variety of groups of youth. So let's say you're in a community, for instance, Nikki mentioned that there are few prevention programs available. So in this case, you may feel pressure to do so many things all at the same time, because you're working with youth who have so many different needs. So when you do a program evaluation, it helps us to see, at first, you need to get started with understanding characteristics of your of the youth that you're serving. We just get started with the descriptives. So what is it out there that they need? What are their struggles? So for instance, in that community, maybe there is a lot of availability of drugs, but there's also high crime, and maybe they don't feel secure. Maybe it's also coupled with poverty, or it could be about loss. So they have lost a family member or a friend to substance use, or they may feel pressured to use that because it has become part of like a subculture for them. So, but we just cannot assume these are the things going on, but instead we can do some basic, as we call in the jargon, the research jargon, the formative research, which basically means, needs assessment. So what are their needs? What do they want? What are their struggles? And it's not only the youth, but also their families, their parents, other stakeholders, and also teachers that they are interacting with in those schools. What are the things that are going on? So we get started with that. So it helps us to see that. And it also gives us information about how long that has been going on and how that we may change that. Because at first, we need to understand different types of risk groups. And I'll come back to that idea in a minute. And I think the second part is also very important. It also helps us to see the real impact we have made in the community. So in general, when you think about the programs, those organizations, you devote so much time and effort, and you have all that staff who's working on that in a very diligent and motivated manner. But in the end of the day, if you just do a satisfaction survey or an exit survey, you are left with people who already stayed in the program. And because they stayed in the program, they will tell you all the good things that happened with them by participating in that program. Well, that really helps us to some extent to understand who is the happiest and who benefited to some extent, but it doesn't help us to see who dropped out. So there are many people who didn't necessarily attend. They signed up, they didn't attend, things happened. So we need to understand what happened with them, what was going on with them. So what were some of the groups that benefited most from that program that we delivered? And what are some of the groups maybe didn't necessarily benefit? Maybe they would benefit, but they couldn't get engaged because they had barriers. Maybe they had transportation barriers. They just didn't have the financial resources means. or they just didn't have the time to attend, again, due to so many other restrictions. So in this case, like when we do a program evaluation, we can identify those subgroups. Then we can also understand objectively over time, like numerically, basically, I'm talking about the change that we may have achieved. Change in terms of substance use, change in terms of criminal involvement, change in terms of GPA or school involvement, school bonding, peer attachment, things like that. So it also can help us, not necessarily those domains, but we can also see how it works. So sometimes you may have experienced that in your organization as well. And when we were working with homeless youth in the drop-in center, that also happened. Sometimes they benefited, they got better, they got jobs, they got enrolled in a institution, and maybe they got stabilized, they quit drinking or using hard drugs. But you just want to know what helped them the most, because you have done so many different things. So when we do a program evaluation, we can figure out which part of that program really helped them, so that we can do that more, because that piece is the most effective one. So that also helps us. And the third one, I think, is one of the main reasons that many organizations understandably do program evaluation, is to require funding. I mean, it's one way of acquiring funding, because in this way you can show to the funding agencies that your evaluation, that you have done this evaluation and your program really helps. And your program helps in this way, XYZ way, and it helps to a certain group of youth, and you want to do that more, but you need more resources. So because of that, you can consider program evaluation not like a final step, but I would say that we should think of it as like the first phase. So you can start with something small, really small, like very small sample, very few people, and then show with that small number of people that it really makes a difference. Then you can acquire some funding to make it larger and reach out to a bigger community. And it's also making it cost effective, because as I said, if you can figure out which part of that intervention helps the most, then we just do that more, rather than focusing on and allocating all of our resources to something else. And that can also be related to not only the program components, like the curriculum. Sometimes it's about the curriculum. What do we have in that program? Sometimes it's about the group. So maybe there is a specific group that benefits the most, and we know that we need to tailor, we are good at tailoring that intervention towards their needs. And sometimes it's about, for instance, the characteristics of the mentors. Maybe there are certain group of mentors that are the most helpful. So that helps you to see that in the future, when you're recruiting mentors, these are the people that you want to go after, because they are the ones that are most engaging and most influential. All right, and in this case, I think we also need to think about the difference between output and outcome evaluation. When we talk about outcome and output evaluation, I realize that these two things are quite mixed to some extent in some people's minds. That's why, as we were preparing the webinar, we really decided that it's important to tease out the difference between the two. Because in output evaluation, it's really about the numbers. So it's about what are the activities you have done in your program. Maybe you did some, you invited parents and you threw out some activities monthly with them, recreational activities. Maybe you provided resources to them. Maybe you had meetings with the teachers for the school-based mentoring program. So what are your deliverables? So these are the things that you would show to the funding agency with the numbers. So here are the number of youth I have reached. Here are the sessions, number of sessions I have conducted. Here are the number of attendees I had for those activities. So it's about the numbers, and that's important because the output evaluation tells us the scope of your program, right? So what is the population that you have reached out to? And how did you use those resources in your organization to deliver that program? And how did that look like? So it gives us a good description of what you have done. And it's valuable, of course. But when I talk about outcome evaluation, in fact, I'm referring to a very different thing. It's the understanding the impact of our program, because we can have a very large program in a community where we reached out to maybe hundreds of youth and their families. We had many people attending our sessions, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we really made an impact. Actually, there is a lot of discussion in research as well, among researchers in academia as well about that. So there are some still today some prevention programs that are very popular. They reach out to hundreds of thousands of people and they have no effects. And even some of them, and I'm not going to name them because that's a different topic, obviously. Even some of them are harmful. Like, can you imagine that you are tailoring, like you are working in a program, you're working for a program for years, you devote all your time to that. But in the end of the day, when you do the outcome evaluation, even though there are so many people who attended that program, you don't find effects, or it harms them. Like, it increases substance use, it increases delinquency, and so on and so forth. So these are completely different stories, but they are important stories that we need to go through. When we do outcome evaluation, we may be using archival data, for instance, school records. We may be using digital data. That's also an ongoing thing. So we have we may be using their data from certain apps. Sometimes they give consent for that. Or we may be doing surveys, and surveys are, more efficient most of the time and cost effective. And here we see that, of course, as compared to output evaluation, you really need to plan ahead with the outcome evaluation. So while you are establishing the program, it's almost like you also consider a design that would go hand in hand with that. So that requires a lot of thinking and planning and resources, obviously. But it also shows that in outcome evaluation, for us, the research rigor is very important. And I'm going to talk about some standards that are determined as gold standards. But also, we need to decide at what level we can really stick to that. So is it really, really reasonable and doable? So in this webinar, we're going to talk about that balance. But I think it's important to put it out there that when we talk about outcome evaluation, we are really talking about following up with those participants, those youth in your program, seeing how they are progressing through time as they are involved in your program. So what is happening with them? And if they drop out, if they do not attend, again, you keep track of them to see how they are doing. So that's the idea. Okay, so here we have a case study. In this case study, we have a community-based nonprofit agency with a budget of $400,000 per year, and we have some staff who's working on match support, marketing, and coordination. And this is an organization that is serving to mentees around ages 13 to 18. And these are mentees who are at risk of substance use. So they are referred through teachers or family members, and they live in a high crime neighborhoods with few resources, and there is opioid use available in those neighborhoods, and their parents may be substance misusing. And in that program that we are imagining, our mentors are community members, and the majority of them are male, whereas our mentees are all boys. And most of them are college students or retirees, which is most of the case, by the way, like as we see from mentor reports. And we have this program going on for 12 months. It's in a group format where we are matching 2 mentors per 10 boys in a group. And it is school-based, so it is after-school program on Wednesday, so it's once a week. And our goal is that we want to promote coping skills of those youth. We want to make sure that they have developed better social and emotional regulation skills, because the ultimate goal here is that we want to prevent substance misuse in the future. So when we think about that program, I think the most important part is that mentees are at risk at 3 different levels. First, they are at risk because their parents may be using drugs. The second risk is that they are in a high crime neighborhood, so they are also at risk of getting involved in delinquency or being exposed to crime, so they are also at risk of victimization. And there is also availability of drugs through the neighborhood, but also through their home environment. And the third aspect is that we see that this is a low resource setting. So that's also creating a lot of risk factors for us. So in this case, we have 3-level risk. And in prevention, when we are working on program evaluation, it's important for us to understand the target group at first. Here, our target group are adolescents, and they are at-risk adolescents, but they are not necessarily using at that moment. So they may be using, they may be maybe experimenting to some extent. Some of them may be regular users, but the risk itself is not defined through the substance use behavior yet, but it is more like they are likely to use. There are so many factors that may drive them to use. So that's how we define the target group. Here, I will just walk you through this case example, thinking about the ideals. I want to emphasize that this is the ideal because I'm aware that this is a very costly thing to do. But the first thing we would do is to determine an age range. So even though our program is serving 13 to 18-year-olds, we need to decide the age range that we will have for our program evaluation. So the program evaluation doesn't have to exactly match our program. It needs to be adhering to the program, of course, but there may be some rationale, some reasons for you to specify an age. For instance, it wouldn't make sense to include 18-year-olds because they are not minors. So maybe you would include 12 to 17-year-olds, right? So things like that. So maybe you would exclude 18-year-olds because they are now because of their status, basically adult status. At this stage, we need to decide on our target group, as I said, but also or inclusion and exclusion criteria. What I mean by that is that, so are there any groups that are, that those youth are using your services, but you want to make sure that your program evaluation is giving you enough information to make sense. So in this case, your sample, like the participants you're going to recruit for your study, need to be homogeneous to some extent. In other words, let me put in this way. So let's say we determine an age range. Here we need to make a lot of decisions. Like, are we going to include all youth in the program, regardless of their substance use? Or am I going to include those who are having parents who are using? If I'm going to include everyone, so let's say I'm being very inclusive. So in this case, I need to define the level of risk for each participant, right? So, or I need to assess risk to some extent because they are exposed to different levels of risk. Then I need to understand if my program works better for high risk groups versus low risk groups. So maybe I'm helping more to youth whose parents are using. Maybe I'm really struggling to reach out to those youth who are coming from high crime neighborhoods as compared to others. So at this stage, we are determining that exclusion. Most of the time in those studies, we exclude youth with severe mental illness because they may need a lot more services, or a lot of other things maybe that may contaminate our findings. So because of that, even though you continue to serve them in your program, or they are eligible for your program, they may not be necessarily eligible for your study. So we decide on the sample size, obviously, but that there is a whole technical detail behind that, so I won't go into all the calculation of that, but it needs to be a reasonable size. So if you're just starting off with program evaluation, the gold standard is that you would start with what we call non-randomized pilot, which means that it's a very first small study, test study, with a small sample. So, and you just test your intervention, your mentoring program, just to see if it is acceptable, if it is making sense for those youth. You get their feedback, and you make sure that it is not harming them. So the next step then will be a larger group of people that you recruit, and you follow up with them. So let's say in this example, in this case example, we are at the second or the third stage, which is, we have done all the prior work. We have, talked to those participants. We made sure that our program wasn't harmful for them. But let's say in the second or the third stage, we are now recruiting people. So in this case, you would recruit 2 different groups. The gold standard, again, like the ideal, would be that you have you have randomization between those groups, meaning that it is by chance that you would either give them mentoring program intervention, so they are matched with a mentor and they start working with that mentor, or they are in the control condition where they may be waiting, or they may be getting another type of intervention that is, quite minimal. So maybe resources, maybe they are attending some recreational activities with their parents, or maybe self-help groups, things like that. And then you follow up with them through time. And again, the gold standard is that you would assess those groups in the very beginning, before the program starts, and in the middle of the program. So in this case example, it was a school-based group, in group format mentoring program, and it was for 12 months. So I would expect that you would assess before the fall semester, and then you would have an assessment in the middle of those two semesters, and also in the end of the spring semester, the academic year. And then you would have a follow-up after that, after the program ended. And our targeted completion rate is 70%. So that means if I recruited 100 people in the beginning, I'm expecting to retain 70 people in the end of the program. So that's like the expectation, but of course it's hard to retain that many people. And because in this program, our goal is to prevent substance use, in terms of what type of data we are going to collect, it needs to be related to substance use. So in this case, our goal is to prevent substance use. We need to assess substance use behavior rather than the attitude. So whether or not they have ever tried any drugs, and also through time, like when we think about the assessment points, we assess substance use behavior in every step of that assessment. So that's the first thing. The second thing is our goal was to improve their skills, right? Social emotional skills, coping skills. So in this case, we also need to assess, we need to have good measures, good and reliable measures to assess their skills. So in survey instrument, let's say. And that also needs to be at the baseline, mid-intervention, post-intervention, and so on. And the third component is that any type of other things that you think could be important. So these are our main variables of interest: substance use and social emotional skills and coping. But there may be other things you are interested in. So these are secondary outcomes. And it's up to you to decide. Like, we recommend that you assess for those as well. But if you have limited resources, obviously you may not necessarily do that. But for instance, if I were doing a study with that group, I would also assess for delinquency and early aggression, because they may not necessarily be involved in crime, but they may be showing early signs of aggression. I would assess for bullying, I would assess for victimization, and also adverse childhood experiences, because they may be exposed to so many different levels of risk factors. So I would be curious about what's going on in their lives. But again, these are, the things that you need to think about before implementing the evaluation, the program evaluation. But regardless, your main interest stays the same. And here, the most important part, I think, is that, and that's, sometimes very confusing for people, and I understand, but you may have some youth who drop out of the program. So sometimes they don't like their match, right? So they don't get along with their mentors. Sometimes they get along with the mentors, but mentors leave. Things happen, right? Like throughout the program, because this is like a 12-month-long program. So in those cases, even though they are not participating to the program anymore, you would try to continue to collect their data. That's very important. Here is the reason why. If I just collect data from youth who stayed in my program, I'm more likely to find good results. Like I'm more likely to find that my program really helped, right? But it's maybe because they stayed. So they benefited from the program and they stayed. Maybe they liked their mentors. They connected with their mentors. So maybe it wasn't about my program, what I'm doing in the school. It was more about the mentor and who they were. But not all my mentors are the same, right? So in this case, I would say that you would try to understand what's going on in that program, and you want to make sure that your results are related to the program itself, not necessarily mentors. Okay. Let me see. All right. I'll just wrap up this slide in a few minutes. So the group comparisons. So as I said, like we collect data no matter how much they participate, but we note down how many sessions of mentoring groups they have attended, and whether or not they completed the program completely, so that we can compare and contrast those groups. And we also care about the program implementation part. So that would require the manual itself. We want to standardize the manual as much as possible so that we know that mentors are doing the same thing. So this is a school-based program. So it's in a group format. So I'd expect that they would have the same type of resources that they deliver. And also we would make sure that we have ongoing supervision and meetings with the mentors to address their concerns. So because this is also part of the program evaluation, you would want to make that quantitative as much as possible. For instance, you would rate the competence levels of the mentor. Maybe you would take notes about the notes that they have, like you would also grade those. Okay, so that was an example of a program evaluation. So that's the ideal. So maybe we can now talk about how realistic that is. And we have Brooke and Nikki who have experience in delivering those interventions. And I'm gonna throw it out to Brooke at first. So what are some of the hurdles that you have experienced while doing those programs? And what are some of the things that you have done to overcome those issues?
Yeah, so first off, I think one of the first things, like every time you say it, it just like kind of reminds myself, one of the biggest hurdles I think as a young professional coming up and trying to figure out the world of mentoring, that whole idea around output versus outcome evaluation and the difference between the two. I think we naturally just lump those two things together in our mind, or we'll hear program evaluation and think very readily like, I know what that is. And then getting into it, we're just kind of talking about two different things. I've sat around, rooms of people and talked about one thing and the other person being on completely different, almost planets sometimes. And it's because we don't really have the language to identify the differences. And so I'm going to continue to use output versus outcome evaluation moving forward, even because that's just been so helpful. And I think will be helpful for my team too, as we try to understand how can we make those two things work together in tandem to support one another, right? So I'll go to kind of our program and the way that we do some of these things. So we do pre and post survey data collection for our young people. And we realized very quickly, you know, I lead a team of 4 people, and we serve quite a bit of people. And of course, we've got upper level management that helps in so many different ways. But as far as boots on the ground, it's the 4 of us. Trying to serve, you know, a very large amount of people, but to do it very lovingly and healthily. And what we realized is for pre and post survey data, getting those community-based matches on the front end, that pre-survey, piece of cake. We can grab that in the intake. We can meet with the family and talk about kind of what we're addressing with mentoring. I'm a big believer, and I tell all of my families, and my team does this as well, when we are meeting with them, that mentoring combats a lot of different issues in the community and a lot of things that we face, that young people face. And we maybe ask these specific questions around this, but this is kind of why we hope that mentoring bridges the gaps for some of these social issues, and substance abuse being one of those. And so I think the transparency on that front end with that caregiver and that young person is just always the best approach, because, you know, you'll get maybe some caregivers that are really unhappy, like, why are you asking these questions? And I think that we have to bring them back to why it's important to ask these questions. And so the pre-survey, super easy, we can grab that. And then the post-survey, what we found is just so challenging, right? Because we are working with people that are just all over Knoxville, and we don't, as a 4-person team, have the capacity to go and meet with every single person at that 6-month or 1-year mark, you know, to grab that information. So we had to really be creative and inventive of how are we going to get this information that matches what our staff capacity is. I think that was the big telltale of, we need to set up a process that makes sense for us, and then also we can communicate effectively to our families as well. Now, through that, what we found is technology is a beautiful thing, and it can do a lot of things, but it can be a barrier. And so I think recognizing that technology is definitely a huge and great approach to that, but having a backup too when that's not feasible. And so we really do a good job. Our match support specialist does a wonderful job of getting those surveys out in time, in a timely manner, and then knowing if there's not a follow-up or we don't receive a survey, what's our next step at that point? And is it communicating with them on a different way other than just a text of a link of, hey, can you complete this survey? And so that was a big piece. I think it took us a while to get there, but we recognized how beneficial that can be. And then I think the other piece that's been just a huge hurdle is also knowing that our families, you know, for our program specifically, we're working with lower income families. A teammate of mine says it best, but they're in the tyranny of the moment, right? Like they're in that moment and can't really, they're focusing on right now and maybe not the next day or the next day. And so to continue to ask them for information is a huge burden, and we recognize that. And so I think being okay with giving them time and making sure that you're not asking too much, making it convenient for them is our utmost kind of number one priority. Of, we know that you may not be able to get to this week, but if it's okay, can we touch base next week and follow up to gather this information? I think it's just been super helpful, of an enlightening moment for our team.
That I think is a very good example of balancing out research rigor and feasibility, because from a research standpoint, you need to make sure that you have good measures, and these are usual scales, and those scales are long. But it's also not feasible to force people. It's also frustrating for those youth and their families to participate in a study because it's so time consuming for them. So you need to find scales that are good in terms of giving you the information you need, but it's also not overwhelming for them. So I think that's important. And the second thing, I think you said, like at first you mentioned that it's always a struggle to collect post-program evaluations. That's one of the reasons that there is a mid-program evaluation, because many people may not necessarily, follow up, even though they finished the program. So that's why we always suggest that you have somewhere in between an evaluation, so that you kind of get that information from them before they may not be interested. So yeah, thank you for sharing, Rick. All right, Nikki.
So we have similar hurdles as well. So we focus kind of more on a group mentoring. So we're not doing individually. So we're doing more of a group setting, really focusing on the youth. Post-tests are really easy, or pre-tests are really easy to collect because you typically can get everybody on board at that time. But you know, that post-test survey is really difficult. Time is not our friend. You know, the youth that we serve are typically transient. They're constantly moving in and out. So those are definitely things that we have to overcome. So for us, some of the things that we do is we try to give ourselves grace and longer time periods. We try to document everything too. So if we're unable to collect a post-test, we want to make sure that we're collecting the information to why we couldn't collect that post-test. And keeping track of that, I think, is just as important as collecting that information as to why you couldn't collect the information. So we really try to make sure that we are giving our staff plenty of time to collect that information. So typically when we're trying to set our pre-test, we may give our staff a week to collect that information. And then for our post-test, we may start that as long as a month to collect all that information so that we have plenty of time. Also working with our staff and our families on different ways to ensure that we have the post-test. Our families aren't cookie cutters, and neither should the way that we interact with them. So making sure that we have different ways of delivering that test. So in person, the virtual, the links, those kind of things. We also at like pickup time when our parents are picking up youth or those kind of things, we'll have stations for parents to come and fill out the survey there on site if they don't have internet or if they don't have technology use. So really trying to come up with a whole bunch of unique different ways to support our families is kind of what we do. I don't think that our hurdles are different from anybody else. And hopefully some of the different, you know, ways that we try to overcome those could be helpful. We really have to, you know, remember that we're there to serve the family and to serve the kids and to really think outside the box on what that looks like for them. So for us in our organization, we've really valued different aspects of providing services and programs. Technology has been great. Virtual has been really helpful. We use different ways to incorporate cell phones and text messages because sometimes they may not have access to a computer or those kind of things. And then ensuring that our survey is realistic to, you know, meet the time constraint that our families have. So just ensuring that we're able to get our point across in maybe 5 questions instead of 15 or 20. So really modifying our post test, our both our pre and post tests to, you know, be time conservant for our families.
Okay, so it's I think you also answered a second question to some extent. So what are some of the strategies that you have used to collect accurate information? So it looks like you're using technology. Any other things you want to add, Brooke, in terms of some of the strategies you have used in your organization to collect information?
Yeah, we actually started doing a really cool new thing where we would look at, you know, I think we all have some level of events, right? Family engagement, something. And so when we then look at who our attendees are at a family engagement event and then look at what are our missing gaps in our survey data, that has been really helpful to have that on site. And so we always take surveys with us at almost any event that we have to ensure that we can gather that when necessary.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so what happens when you have missing data? How do you handle that? And I see some questions in the chat, and I think the first question is kind of related to that as well. Sometimes you ask questions and you just get vague or short answers. That's also, I mean, it's not missing data, but it's also not useful to some extent. So how do you handle that?
For us, I think one big first one is understanding that we are going to have gaps in the data, I think is the big piece of that, knowing the population we're working with, knowing that we're doing the best we can to do the services. And that's always got to be first and foremost, right? We've got to do quality service, quality mentorship. That needs to be at the front of our minds, and giving a little bit of grace that there is going to be gaps, but also being able to explain why there are gaps. You know, when you're discussing, hey, we have all this data, but you may be seeing some missing pieces. This is why, and it's because of the population we work with and how we're meeting them where they're at. It's still going to have some gaps. And then I think when you ask about the vague responses, I readily think in my mind that we kind of have to be very specific with how we ask things. And I think a next step for our program is being able to break up our youth survey into age ranges, because what a 4-year-old is going to answer on specific things looks vastly different than a 17-year-old. And so I'm really hoping that we can start to identify what are those differences and how can we make those surveys match to make the data make sense. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, exactly. I definitely agree. I think that was a great answer. And also it fits in with our case study, because in this case study, these are youth from ages 13 to 18. So when you think about their grade level, they are not that different in terms of their reading ability. But if you're working with a group of youth that are, the age range is so large, obviously you need to developmentally tailor all of those resources, all of those survey questions. Definitely. That also explains why we start with the target group, right? Like we need to tailor everything towards that. Okay. What about differences between those groups? So sometimes we're working with youth who are coming from a variety of backgrounds, learning types. Again, it's connecting to the developmental stage that they're in. How do you cater to that variety?
So I think, we have to, one, know our kids, know our youth, know the people that we're serving, and give grace and give opportunity and allow space for anything to happen. We work with kids. So really anything can happen at any given time. So ensuring that your surveys, your pre and post tests are able to be delivered in different varieties. So being able to have the opportunity to have it read out loud, being able to offer it virtually, or electronically, just being able to have it in different formats would be helpful. The other thing is too, you have to be able to give your youth space. So you may have youth who cannot concentrate and get this whole survey done in one setting. So making accommodations based on the youth's need. And allowing that. Sometimes, we've been with our youth for so long that we kind of know their strengths and their weaknesses, and being able to cater towards that. And also, the one thing that I always like to tell my staff when we're giving surveys is to remember that, to give yourself time to cater to your youth. So if you have a youth who's having a really rough day, that might not be the best day to give them the survey or to have them sit down and take the test. So instead of rushing to get your surveys done, allow yourself time in your youth time to be able to take this test over a couple of days instead of having it rushed in one setting. I really think those have been beneficial for us. And then, knowing your kids is pretty helpful too, in the sense of, are you able to have your youth grouped together to take a survey and work together on the survey, not work together, but be in the same room in the survey? Or do you have to have like a quiet space? So really accommodating for your youth is really beneficial. And then I think, again, the last thing is just making sure that your survey can be delivered in several different ways. However, I would like to state, whatever you do for your pre-test, try to mimic that in your post-test. It would be really helpful. So like we take notes if we had to read a test out loud to our youth, or we have it already where they can put headphones in and have it read to them. And then mimicking that again for the post-test.
Yeah. And also regarding the program evaluation, you would want to keep the survey the same in all of those evaluations. So that also speaks to the format as well. So if you start online, you continue online, things like that. And also whatever you are doing to tailor it to the youth. And I hear that you mentioned that you would offer it in different formats. For instance, that kind of reminds me of how we were doing it with the homeless youth. So because they were not necessarily having a good reading level, and some of those scales were very hard to understand for them. So we would have different like research assistants to read those questions to them, because they also didn't feel secure enough to say that it didn't necessarily mean something to them. So they wouldn't necessarily want to voice how that feels like, because sometimes they feel uncomfortable to do so. So we had, assistants to collect that data and to read those questions and explain those questions to them. So that was helpful, and we made sure that these are not the outreach workers or the mentors. So I think that's also important, because there are some questions in the chat about the confidentiality. So that I think speaks to how you would want to make sure that they are in a separate place on their own, either reading those questions and answering, or they would be in a room that's quiet and they are in one-on-one, and it's not necessarily available to the parents or the mentors or any staff. Brooke, what are some of the ways in which that you cater to different types of youth?
I loved everything Nikki said. I think that was also so just helpful to understand that we have to just meet people where they're at, and that's 100% going to look different from every person that we encounter. We tell mentors in training that we don't meet any families that are similar, and so anytime we see something once, we try to explain it to mentors so they have an understanding of what they could be stepping into and what type of situation. And I think it's very similar with this, with wanting to collect survey data. When we go and meet with families and when young people, we actually have an iPad now that we utilize to take that survey on. So one big thing I've learned is kids love technology, most of them, and to be able to give them something that's fun and exciting for them to play with. And then I've even so far said, hey, if you do this for me, I know surveys aren't the most fun thing in the world, but for me to bring a fun person to come and spend time with you in the future, we really just have to get this today. If it's a bad day, totally cool, we can do it later. But if you do it today, I can pull up a game for you right after that. And you can play that while I spend the rest of the 20 minutes talking with your parent or guardian. And so I think being able to offer some kind of fun idea or something to be like, hey, I know that this isn't the most fun thing for you to have to do right now, but for me to be able to provide some level of support and for this program to work with you, it's really important for us to ask you these questions. And then we also tell kids, like, we're going to ask these questions again. So I'm sorry. I think just that transparency, it's so important for kids. I don't want them to think, hey, I've done it once, I'm done, but it is going to be asked again. And so we try to tell people that on the front end. And then also, so we go into homes and meet with families and youth for the first time. And so we don't always know what the home life is going to be like or what the home is going to be like. And so I think when we get there, having to gauge, is this an appropriate setting for this young person to be able to take this survey right now, or should we follow up and do it later? And then I have, I think in my learning and my growing, I can be really transparent of, I have put a survey in front of a caregiver that was unable to read, and to have that moment in my mind of like, how insensitive, Brooke, like how much, like you should have known that. And I should have known that. I own that. And so making no assumptions going into it, I think is a big piece for me, because, I'm just bad about making assumptions. I have biases. We all do. And so being able to know, hey, I'm going to walk into this fresh minded, and being able to meet them wherever they're at as I get to know them. It can't just be like your first thing right off the cuff. You have to get to know them a little bit.
Yeah. And also sometimes, you don't know, you just assume, and they may not necessarily feel comfortable to tell you. So yeah, definitely. I agree. For the last question, so this is a question that I'll throw to Brooke and Nikki, and afterwards we're going to have a Q&A with the webinar participants. So what are some of the low to no cost solutions that you have created in your programs? So maybe we talk about that a little bit.
So for us, the big one is to know the data that's already out there, because we don't need to we don't need to survey people that information's already ready in our local area. And so I think getting really comfortable with knowing what's already out there. I love, like, I had a friend one time tell me, like, don't reinvent the wheel, add to the speed. And so I very much like want to add to the speed of the work that's already being done here in Knoxville. And so I think that's number one, is kind of finding what is it that you're trying to get out of this program evaluation, and what are the kind of all the pieces that work in tandem with that, and being able to bring that information to your volunteers and to your families is just going to add support for you as you're trying to gauge these other pieces of your program. So that's a big one. And then another piece that has been so helpful, you heard me say at the beginning, I was an intern when I started here at KLF, and we have just a wonderful partnership with our local university, University of Tennessee. Go Vols, had to do it. And so I think that has been a really pivotal piece in providing interns that they're trying to learn and they're growing and they have these new fresh ideas. And then we also, need more capacity. And so I think being able to provide them a learning opportunity, but also adding capacity to what you're already doing, again, adds speed to that wheel. That's been a really low to no cost solution to help us add capacity to our program overall. And then I'll put a plug in. I have looked at the NMRC for just about every piece of Amachi to just see what's already out there, because if it's already, if there's already support there, I'm not going to keep trying to build my own new thing if there's already been something proven to be effective and work. And so I've looked at different survey options in the NMRC and that's really helped me to understand what are other people doing nationally and how can we kind of match that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And it's also related to one of the questions in the chat. I also wrote it there. So now that it came up, feel free to look at the NMRC website. We have a nice research toolkit page there. And underneath, you will see that different types of topics that you may want to assess in your program. And there are some good scales that you can use, and there are links to those scales. And most importantly, we also tell you the group of youth that would be kind of fitting in with that scale, like the reading level, age range, characteristics, things like that. So that's also something to add in there. Nikki?
So first of all, I've always loved the don't reinvent the wheel, but I've never heard the add the speed. So I think that's my new favorite saying. But liking to go from that, closed mouths don't get fed. So working with your partners, your community partners, and anybody, outside that could offer support is really beneficial, because there are resources out there, and just working together. Most of us have community partners that we're working with. The other thing that I would like to add is look within your organization too, and use your staff that you have and the talents that they have, and really utilize them. For us, as odd as it was, we had a sleeper data analysis right under our nose, until we started finding out what our staff were passionate about. We didn't know until we started asking. So utilizing your staff and their skills and what their talents are, and then really utilizing your community partners and asking for assistance. We're in an era where there's so many things that are being created that it's a good possibility it's already out there. You just have to ask. So really looking at those community partners. We partner with our local college too for the interns, which is really a benefit for them and us. So really just kind of getting out there, putting your organization out there as well, and just seeing what's around. There's so many things, and you don't know unless you ask.
Yeah. Definitely. I love the idea of working with the interns, and it's also making our programs more sustainable, right? So that's also a very important part of it. Not only about the lower no cost solution, but it's also about keeping it going, right? Thank you so much. And I see that there are a few questions in the chat, and feel free to ask other questions as well. So I think it's time for a Q&A now. I answered 3 of them already, so we can go back to those. Some of them seemed like for research related, but I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about incentives Like I want to hear from Brooke and Nikki about that. Like, have you ever tried giving incentives in collecting data, and has that been helpful for you?
Oh, absolutely. Youth are very food motivated.
Yeah.
And so are families. So when we have to get a lot of data, we typically offer like family dinners and have the families come to family dinner. And then that way that, everyone is able to eat and be together. Families don't have to worry about feeding the littles, and they're still able to get some, what we need done from them. So incentives are always really great. It really does help our families. Sometimes we offer gift cards and those kind of things, to better utilize the support for the families. So incentives are really great. I loved Brooke's incentive. We do something similar where if they do so many questions, if the youth do so many questions, they get a break where they get to play a game. And then they do it again. So incentives are really helpful. I am all for incentives.
And food makes everyone happy. So
Always.
definitely. In one program, we were collecting data as part of like graduation. So it's like graduation of the program. So in the post survey, so they would come to the center and participate, but also fill out the surveys. So it's kind of merging it together. Brooke?
Yeah, so yes, incentives 1,000% are super helpful. I know there's a lot of limitations around that, right? And so we have gotten really creative with what we kind of frame as incentives. And so we actually had a local university organization reach out about wanting to collect data on some of our families. And we kind of had a brainstorming session, and we're actually able to come up with a really cool opportunity where they're going to provide an event for us, kind of a Halloween event that families can come to. Kids can get candy, which they get really excited about, and then their boots on the ground surveying them during that event. And so then they're going to share that data with our program. So we're actually able to provide a family engagement opportunity for our young people, collect data on something that is very important to who we're serving, and then those young people as college students get kind of an insight into what it would look like to volunteer with us. So I count that as like a 3-tier win across the board, and I think that that's another way that you can partner with local universities to help inform your program on different research methods and ideas and concepts, because they're fresh in that and they're learning it right now and get really excited about it. And so I think that's just something that I thought would be a cool idea to share.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of incentives, have you ever given any gift cards?
Not gift cards specifically. We've offered food, and then we actually, so for our site-based matches, when we're in local elementary schools, we do our end of kind of year survey with them, the post survey in tandem with their celebration day. And so they're getting certificates for completion and then completing a survey in that same day. So it doesn't feel like it's bogged down for them to be like, again, but then they're getting this really cool opportunity to feel special and unique for completing the whole program. So not gift cards specifically. We actually have not done that. Now on the volunteer side, we have with different training opportunities, but not specifically with survey data.
Okay, I wanted to ask because in some program evaluation projects, we give, especially if the survey is long. I mean, I'm emphasizing that sometimes it's long and you really need to motivate people. And sometimes we give gift cards as an incentive to a department store, sometimes to a coffee shop or a movie ticket, things like that. That's an option, but of course it depends on your budget, and if you have funding to do so, this is actually one of the reasons that you may get research funding for that type of program evaluation, and you can definitely put that in your budget. But there are also ethical issues we need to think about. It shouldn't be coercive, it shouldn't be a huge amount, things like that. So I love the idea of recreational activities and food. That's a lot nicer. All right, so I also see another question in the chat. Maybe we go ahead with this, and I want to hear from Nikki first for this one. Or attendee is saying that sometimes founders ask a lot of information. How do you communicate with them about these challenges and also get them the information they are asking for? Have you ever experienced that, Nikki?
Yeah, so we experience that often. The other thing that we experience that kind of goes hand in hand is that we have several funders requesting similar information, but not the same information. So how do we get that information too and kind of make everybody happy? So the first thing, I've said it several times, always document why you can't get information. Always make sure that you're making that a point, that you're documenting reasons to why you're not able to get information. The other thing that I always suggest is when you're faced with a problem, always try to have a solution at hand. So like when we go to our funders, for instance, we had a situation where they were wanting the way that we give attendance to be in 3 different ways. And unfortunately, that just didn't work. So we kind of went to all of our funders and we're like, hey, like this isn't going to work for us, but if we could do it this way. And we kind of had a solution, and they were more prone to helping us when we had a bit of a solution. They didn't entirely agree with it, but they were more willing to work with us and be a little bit more lenient in us collecting information. So I always say document the reasons to why you can't and try to come up with a solution. So for instance, if you have families who are uncomfortable giving certain personal information, maybe working with your funders and asking them, okay, if we can't collect if we can't collect income, could we collect how many people are in the household? And trying to find a solution to maybe shift it just a bit, that you're still providing information that is beneficial, and still making your families feel comfortable. I hope that helped. I feel like it was a long way around it.
Yeah. I think that totally makes sense. Sometimes you cannot necessarily collect that information and it happens. And also sometimes they wanted information early. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but it's happened for us in some programs. Sometimes founders want that information, but it's sensitive information, and you may not necessarily have that trust with those youth at first, right? So it's kind of strange to ask them right up front. Sometimes you need time to build that trust so that they feel comfortable with you. So yeah, and also communicating that with them would be helpful. Brooke, you have any answers, any suggestions for that?
So I think for us, again, we're working with people that are in tyranny in the moment, and we know that asking more is just sometimes burdensome, but I think it goes back to that layer of transparency. So we used to have a pretty heavy intake and interview process for our families and young people. And so we kind of made that a lot more concise, and then started to look at what are things that we could put on an application that are optional. I think that that's a big piece of it is, you have to know what needs to be asked 100%, and then what can be optional out of comfortability. And I found that caregivers were a lot more likely to answer those questions on an application than to have that ongoing conversation with staff in person. And I think we tell our funders that we are at the disposal, kind of what the caregiver is willing to share with us. And so that looks very different. And then understanding why you have those gaps in the data, and being able to explain, like I did ask these questions, that documentation piece Nikki was talking about, but not everybody's going to be comfortable, and it's all through self-report, right? When we're self-reporting out things, that's just a challenge in itself. So I think that those are challenges. There's going to be challenges getting all that information, but being able to communicate why it's a challenge, documenting that you've tried, and then just trying to be creative. I think that once we say that we can't do something, then we definitely can't do it. And so being willing to try at least.
Okay, all right. Yeah, sounds great. Thank you, Brooke. I think we can now turn to Jake.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much, Brooke, Gizem, and Nikki, for all of those insights. And I think I'm taking away a lot in terms of the program that I work with outside of Mentor to go and bring this back to my team. I love that phrase, closed mouths don't get fed. And I think that's a perfect transition into a couple more resources, just as reminders. Please do feel free to reach out to the National Mentoring Resource Center. Again, you can ask, or you can sign up for technical assistance and training on this very type of topic. And as well as I linked the page on there for our research board members. So you can go there and check them out and see if there are any in your region, or that you're already maybe partners with the university that they're at or whatever. Again, to connect with these folks to help you with this. You're not alone in this. And I think that our panelists today did a really amazing job at kind of representing that this is very much a group effort, and we all can kind of help each other out with this. We don't have to reinvent the wheel and that sort of thing. So please feel free to check out these resources. Again, a email will be going out in about 5 days or so, sometime next week, with the recording, with the slides, where you'll be able to access these links and everything else like that. But otherwise, again, a huge thank you to our panelists and moderator. Thank you all to that joined us today in this webinar. And feel free to reach out if you have need anything. Everybody, hope you all have a wonderful day and take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.